Well, good evening. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you, and it's always a hard act to follow Pinky. Pinky talked to you about being in space and some of the experiences and what we do there. We always work very hard. We're employed by you, the people of this country, to perform science and repair satellites and launch and service the Hubble and a number of other things. But we all have separate journeys, and there's so many young people in the audience tonight. What I want to encourage them to think about is it's not what's around you or even the past of your family. Your journey is very much determined by what's in you. So while I talk about my particular journey, that's not the formula. There have been more than 400 people in space from around the world. Astronauts, cosmonauts, Canadian astronauts. Even right now, we have some Chinese astronauts in space, Europeans, Japanese, each one with a separate journey. Mine started here in the state of Washington, and I had my eyes up in space as well. I didn't know about all those other galaxies. I only knew about ours, the Milky Way. And now we know what galaxies look like in 3 dimensions. So think of our Milky Way like this. And we're actually orbiting a sun out on one little arm of it, one little piece of it. We get to see it every night, though. We are on this very unique planet. Well, we thought it was unique. I thought it was unique until Pinky told me there were a few 100 million out there. But that's kind of exciting, because I have an app on my iPhone right now that's every time a new planet is discovered, it sends me a text message. And I get one at least once a day. How exciting, because when I was in high school, we didn't think there were other planets around any other sun. I am a second-generation American, proud to be an American, just as my grandparents were when they immigrated to this country from Scotland with one-way tickets. Talk about exploration, leaving your home, your family, with never any anticipation of returning for a new life of discovery. And they settled in Oregon State, where my father was born. My father was the middleest of 2 sons, joined the Marines to fight in World War II. And for those of you that are veterans, the words Tarawa probably mean something to you. The South Pacific, the Marshalls, the Gilberts, the 4th Marine Corps. That was my dad. But I didn't know about any of those things until he passed away in his 80s. I didn't know that this very gentle man with great dreams had persevered through some very tough times. But now that I look back on it, I realize what he was teaching his children. He decided with my mother to homestead in Washington State. Anybody know where Outlook is? I know there are a few out there. That's near Sunnyside, which is in the Yakima Valley, about 30 miles from Yakima. And my parents took a piece of unimproved land. That means no water, no electricity, no utilities, and they put up a tent. And that's where they lived for the first year. And then they lived in sheepherder huts for the next 4 to 5 years. That's where I was till I was 3 years old. I thought I was living in heaven, though. What a great environment. And the night skies out there were incredible, as you know when you go to eastern Washington. So in this picture in the lower left-hand corner is the Outlook post office, as it's looked for about 60 years. They just keep repainting it white. 98938. We can see Mount Adams off to the west and Mount Rainier, and we used to be able to see Mount St. Helens. And that lower right-hand picture is what the road across from our house looks like, and the Rattlesnake Hills. And at night, there are no lights there. There were no lights there. There's still very few lights there. But coming out of those hills every night was the Milky Way, this big stripe of skies, of stars that I looked at. Well, my dad was a dreamer, and his dream was to have a herd of Hereford cattle. He was very proud of that. I was eventually the oldest of 4 kids. That's my dad standing behind me, and I'm a year old, and he's very proud of the fact that he's balancing me on this steer. But but not to fear. My mother's taking the picture, so she's pretty proud as well. So growing up on the Diamond Double Bar Ranch in Outlook, Washington, with 2 younger brothers and eventually a younger sister was a great experience. We learned to be resourceful. We were self-sufficient. We grew our own food. We canned our own food. We had our cattle. We were definitely self-sufficient. You learned a lot of biology and physics and chemistry in those days. You knew what electricity was because when you ran into a barbed wire fence, you got a little bit of a jolt. You learned what conductors were and what insulators were. But that Milky Way really captured my imagination. About 3 years ago, I ran into an old neighbor who's now retired here on the west side. And she recounted a story to me about meeting me when I was about 3 years of age, wandering around lost at the Grandview County Fair. And she said to me, she says, well, where are you from? And she knew full well who my parents were. Where are you trying to go? And she said, rather than pointing east, west, south, or north, I pointed up. So I guess I had that in my heart all along. Well, growing up on a cattle ranch, I showed 4-H steers with my brother for 9 years and showed a horse, and we had dogs and learned a lot about responsibility, became part of the family business. That's what farming and ranching is all about. You get a few paychecks out of the year. It's usually at the end of the year. And we became a very tight family. We still are. I learned about teamwork. I learned that it's a community. Every Memorial Day is branding day, and the whole neighborhood gets together, and we help each other out. Anyone has a problem, we all help each other out. That's about community. It's about having neighbors that have been in that particular location for 50 and 60 years. So I grew up in a community that was supportive, but it also believed in not putting boundaries around kids and people, about dreaming big. And I loved From Earth to the Moon, and Sputnik was launched when I was 8, and we all went out to look for it. Little did I know that there was another young man that was born around the turn of the century, the same age as my grandfather, by the name of Robert Goddard, who eventually would become the father of modern rocketry because he had a dream. He dreamt when he was 17 about building a rocket to go to Mars. You have to remember when this was. This was a very long time ago, but it propelled him into physics. Eventually, John Glenn flew when I was in junior high, and he was a Marine like my dad, and my dad thought he was the greatest person, so he became my role model. John Glenn, a Marine like my dad, a good person, been in space, and saw the Earth from a different perspective. And then John Kennedy, our president, announced to the world from a football stadium that we're going to the moon. How exciting. Not within a long lifetime, but within the next 10 years. And he said this country was going to be conquered by those who would go to space, and that we would grow our education to meet that would transform our world. All the things that Pinky talked about came true. It did. A lot of the world around us, our quality of life, from exploring the moon, to the satellites that help us understand the Earth, all came to being. But once I got excited about that, I really didn't know what the pathway was. My 8th grade teacher, Mr. Miller, said as I was going from 8th grade to Sunnyside, I was in Outlook grade school, and I was graduating from the 8th grade, and he said, "What do you want to become, Bonnie?" And I said, "Well, I want to build spaceships, and I want to fly in them." And he says, "You'll have to take algebra." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Trust me." And I did. Algebra, geometry, trigonometry, math analysis. I was a cheerleader and in sports. Got to my senior year, got some financial aid, and was accepted to the University of Washington, but I didn't know what to major in. And finally, I talked to my physics teacher, Mr. Anderson, and I said, "What should I major in?" And he says, "Bonnie, I think you should become an engineer." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Trust me." And I did. 1967, I entered engineering at the University of Washington. And while I thought I was going to be an aero, and I think I'm still adopted by the aero department, I went into material science and engineering, and I met a man there, the chair of the department, by the name of Jim Muller, Dr. Muller. We called him Doc. And Doc was working on NASA projects, specifically on the space shuttle. And he said, "Bonnie, you need to come in my department if you really want to work on a spaceship." because we're working on the space shuttle. Now remember, we're just landing on the moon at the time, 1969, and here we are already thinking about this shuttle. Actually, the concept started back in the 60s. So while I was an undergraduate, we went to the moon, we looked back at our Earth, and we're thinking about this reusable space plane. And the only way it's reusable is because of the new materials being developed. And I am going to be in that department that's going to be on the leading edge of that development. Well, I graduated in ceramic engineering, eventually went to work for Rockwell International in California, and that's a picture of me as an engineer working on this thermal protection system. And they actually did a little article. I applied to be an astronaut that year, but I wasn't accepted into Pinky's class. He was in the 78 class, but NASA offered me a job, and I went to work for them, and in 1980, I was selected as an astronaut. We all look pretty young there, don't we, Pinky? It's been a while. I have had a great astronaut career. I've had 5 flights. I've trained in Russia. I've trained to fly on the Russian cosmonaut Soyuz and visited the International Space, or the Mir space station twice. Met women astronauts from all over the world, including Valentina Tereshkova. This is at the Kremlin and Red Square. Trained to drive tanks in case of an emergency away from the launch site. Worked with some really incredible people. Helped to design the hardware. Check it out. These are white rooms. Worked with the scientists and engineers. Trained with scientists and engineers all around the country. I wasn't an astronomer, but I had to learn astronomy, just like the astronomers had to learn a little material science. And we cross-trained because of these complex missions we had. My last flight was in 1998, was the 8th flight to the Russian space station Mir. We had a cosmonaut on board, and we exchanged crew members. I remember thinking as I walked across the gantry, it probably would be my last flight. There was sort of a magic number at that time, around 5, although a couple of my classmates went on to fly 7 flights. And so I tried to drink everything in, kind of memorize it as I went. You know, suiting up in the white room, walking across the gantry, being buckled into my seat, the launch. For some reason, on the 5th flight, I can remember every minute of those 8 minutes. It didn't go by as fast as it did before. I could remember the vibration under my feet. I could remember unbuckling and suddenly being weightless. We rendezvoused with the Mir space station, perfect rendezvous, opened the hatches, spent 5 days with them. On 3 of my flights, we had space lab flights, and we did material science experiments and biology experiments and fluid physics experiments, looking at this variable we call microgravity, weightlessness, like pressure and temperature. It changes the physics and chemistry of the world around us. And as we go back to the moon and deal with a 1/6 G and hopefully onto Mars with 1/3 G, a lot of the work that we've been doing on the space station will help us build the equipment and to acclimate to those environments. So I was one of the last crews to see the Mir space station in orbit. It was eventually deorbited, just as the Skylab had been deorbited in the 70s. And my last flight was in early 98. And we started building the International Space Station in late 1998. Undocking from the Mir was a little bit bittersweet for us as well. Got to sit on the commander's side and push a few buttons. Entry was exciting. Entry was exciting for me because I was an engineer on the thermal protection system. And yes, you lost a very inconsequential tile. But we never lost the critical stuff, the things that made this vehicle a 100-mission vehicle, to protect it from 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit without melting like all other spacecraft would have. Those things worked, and I was really proud to be a part of that space shuttle team, 100,000 engineers and scientists across the country. I watched the plasma glow go by, and then we glided to a landing in Florida, perfect landing by my commander, Terry Wilcutt, exited the vehicle in the evening. They landed along the center line for a glider. That's pretty good. 200,000-pound glider. Shook hands on it. The sun set. It was my last mission. But it was a great experience that I looked back on. I felt very lucky because along the way, I had very special people that let me dream. My parents, my teachers. And part of that was I was always encouraged to share my goals, not to be bashful about them. Always to try to achieve excellence, to do the best I could in everything. Because in the end, that's really what helps us go forward. So 5 flights, 2 of them on Columbia, the vehicle I helped to build. It was pretty remarkable as an engineer. My dad was proud. That was always fun. But I kept telling him, he and my mother, they taught me how to dream. And I watched the space station being assembled, piece by piece, again a dream that had been 15 years in the making. And you can see it come over. Some beautiful passes this week, even featured on CBS News. Almost as bright as Venus. And right now there are 6 people orbiting on the International Space Station, and there are 3 Chinese taikonauts on their own vehicle right now. This is the century of human exploration in space, true exploration. The station's about a football field wide. It has research laboratories from the United States, Europe, and Japan. It's doing some great work. This is their picture of the last shuttle reentry. This is a picture looking back out to all the stars. And, Carl Sagan was right. There are billions and billions of stars. The Hubble telescope shows us many more than you can see. But while some of the crew was always looking at the Earth, I was getting a much better view out the window. So we look at all these people in space doing work that help us explore. They're international. That is the environment that's paving the way to the future, and the shuttle was a big part of that. I was proud to be part of that program, and now we're entering new stages, and we must not forget to explore. We must not forget to give back to the future generations, such as the Museum of Flight and its educational programs and the Pacific Science Center. We need to inspire the next generation to help us go forward. No nation has ever suffered from exploring, but those nations that have stopped exploring have disappeared into history. And you can probably remember who they are from your books. So what's next? Well, my vision, I hope, is a lunar base. Certainly that's where Russia is talking about going now in Europe, and Japan mining helium-3. I won't be able to go to Mars, although I understand the Dutch have a one-way trip now. But, I want to see someone walking on Mars. I want to see us digging a trench and finding below the surface microbial life that can help us. So it's not a question of revisiting, in my mind, the Viking landers that went to Mars in 1976. Not a question of if. History tells us it is when and who. And it will be those nations that take the first step and continue on. Robert Goddard was my hero. He had great ideas, but he was ostracized. And despite the ostracizing of many of his peers, he continued on. He died before he went to the moon. He'd actually been ostracized in the New York Times. But on the day that we went to the moon, the New York Times published a public apology to him. If you go back and read his history, he wrote a speech when he graduated from high school. And in that speech, he said, "It's difficult to say what is impossible, for the dreams of yesterday become the hopes of today and the realities of tomorrow." And I want to make one more piece of history tonight. For the first time ever in my history, west of the mountains, I'm going to wear my cowboy hat. Thank you.